sun's coming up.
Hello and welcome to the CoSM Podcast. On today's episode, Alex and Allyson have a discussion with Sebastian Siegel, filmmaker, author, integral artist, and director of the upcoming film Grace and Grit, which chronicles the true love story of the philosopher Ken Wilber and his wife Treya, starring Mena Suvari and Stuart Townsend. Ken Wilber's story and philosophy has been profoundly influential to so many as it seeks to synthesize all human knowledge and experience into one philosophical framework. The Greys and Sebastian talk about his new movie, Integral Theory, Ken Wilber's legacy, and so much more in this episode. So without any further ado, please welcome Alex, Allyson, and Sebastian Siegel.
Hey, Sebastian Siegel, welcome to the CoSM Podcast. Thanks so much for agreeing to be on today. We look forward to talking with you about integral storytelling.
Yeah, and as long as we're talking about integral storytelling, what can you tell us about your integral experience of this sequestration, the thorns, the roses, any of those?
I think that for so many years of having different types of meditative or artistic expressive practices and contemplative practices, there are obviously a number of different perspectives that this draws in by nature, thinking about the self, thinking about the other, evaluating and thinking and trying to drop into perspectives from all around the world, different socioeconomic perspectives, different country perspectives, and etc., the perspective of the globe, of the world, of the animals, of all sentient beings, of evolution itself, of the earth itself, of the sun and the stars beyond. And so I've been enjoying that because I feel that that might be natural or pedestrian to someone like the both of you, obviously, or myself, or other artists or philosophers. But I think that it's sort of becoming the zeitgeist, that's the rose of that people are having to, or being demanded to take on those perspectives, whether they are aware of it or not. They're having to look around and hear the sound of birds, which is increasing no matter where you are, and say, what's really going on here? The difference between what's happening and what's really going on, the difference between the plot and the theme. I would say that's a sweet rose. I would say one of the thorns on the way to the head of that beautiful rose would be being out and seeing how some people are panicked and afraid, and understandably, but by nature, then they're shut off and closed, and that creates a sort of tightness, in the streets sometimes, and in the world, or in the places that we go outside. And I think that's it'll pass, and it's a process, right? But it's not my favorite, that thorn. It's a prickly thorn, that one. I think about, to put a button on that, how some people love Friday, right? Or some people love Hanukkah or Christmas or whatever the thing is. And I think, well, there's no need to wait for that. Let's have that every day. Let's have that experience every day of the magic of being alive, right? And so I think seeing how some people are feeling that resonance in the world of sort of fear and concern and panic is a thorn on the way to that sweet rose of transcendence.
Yeah. I've been having moments of feeling like so lucky and grateful to be surrounded by a bit of nature, and to have a thing because of the somewhat isolated nature of painting as a thing, as a painter, you're used to time by yourself. And so this is actually a time where there are less obligations, and I can do more of what I really love to do. And so along with that, there comes of course, there's an organization going on, and there are things to do, and so
a lot of things.
But it's then you crack open to the as you were saying, the kind of the resonant field of panic and death and the management of mortality on a social scale that has never I've never experienced in my lifetime. It's more like wartime because of the tens of thousands of deaths nearby, just in rapid succession, because of this thing that has united the world. The pandemic.
Yeah, there is a segment of our population that is prepared for this. And there's a segment of our population that is not, and a very large segment that is suffering. So you can't be too joyous. You dare not openly be too joyous in the amount of peace and practices that you're able to finally, bear down on, like that you always say you're going to do, and then you do them, it's like now doing them. And so anyway, I think a lot of us feel that we want to be better on the other side. And we're looking at it as a closed packet of time in a sense, although we know things will be different on the other side. In many ways, they'll still be, all of the negativities and positivity is waiting for us over there too. So,
well, it's interesting, the shores we imagine, that we're going toward. And like you were saying, that there's a lot more people hearing birds and seeing a beautiful, clearer environment. And so it seems to also be a time of choice regarding that.
Yeah.
And,
well, so
yeah.
What projects are you busy with? Are you editing your movie, or is it in post, or what are you working on?
The film is totally done.
It is.
Yeah, the final score is being done right now by Kim and Catherine Kluge, who did Martin Scorsese's Silence. I think another film. Yeah,
I'm like one of the few people that saw Silence because it's so tough and amazing. But anyway, so the score is being done.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think they're the right individuals. We met through my brilliant editor, Christopher, and he and I spent long days for many months at his house from morning to night, carving out this story, and then hit it off with the Kluges, and they sort of really resonated with the film and the story, and we were simpatico. And I think about that film, Silence, being experiential. And I think about the films that really formed me as a storyteller and impacted me. And so I wanted to make this story experiential, that the viewer goes into it and leaves it hopefully transformed in some sort of way, whether they're aware of that or not.
Well, I wondered, what was your earliest encounters or, introduction to Ken Wilber?
Such a great question, right? We always ask this amongst ourselves.
We know. It's unforgettable, right?
It really is, yeah.
We never forgot, but tell us.
It's like, when did you start dropping acid? Or when was your first kiss? It's always like, how'd you get
I don't know when I first did acid. You never hear that.
Yeah.
You never. Anyway, you met him and you turned on.
But he's like that. It's I liken it to going to Egypt. Do you ever forget going to Egypt?
No.
Like if you ask somebody, have you ever been to Egypt? Do they have?
You ever done acid?
Do they have exactly? And so meeting Ken Wilber was like that for us.
Well, let's hear.
So
what happened for you? Was it the books first? Was it personal encounter? What was it?
Not to tell too many about too many of the rivers and pyramids on that journey through Egypt, but essentially, I loved psychology, depth psychology, and philosophy, and there were many authors who I loved, have been hugely impactful for me. And I was going through a period of voracious reading, and in my 20s, and I had fallen in love most recently with Alan Watts, and I had read everything he had ever written, every book, and listened to everything that he had ever, recorded. And after that, there were many other authors that I loved, from Schopenhauer and Schelling and Nietzsche and etc., but not like Alan Watts, where I wanted to read every single thing, right? And then through many, many, many routes, all of a sudden, Ken Wilber starts coming to me. Someone says, "Oh, you have to read this book," or I knew a gentleman who had passed away, and his wife had said, you know, he loved this book. You have to read this book. And someone else I was talking to at an art show, she said, you know, you remind me so much of my father, the way you talk about transcendence and the cosmos. And I said, well, what was your father reading before he passed? And she said, oh, he was in love with Ken Wilber. So then at that point I said, okay,
oh my God,
this is showing up. You know, there's some sort of synchronicity, which I don't want to misinterpret personally, but I need to get with the program. I need to be one of the petals on the flower and recognize that other petal. So I started reading him, and I first read A Brief History of Everything, and I spent about a month reading it, and I literally didn't do anything else other than read that book and make notes in it. I'm a very slow reader because I don't like to turn the page until I feel I'm embodying something, and I've written enough notes on it to be able to not just articulate it, but to live from the space. And I found that book to be so rich and transformative and radical on so many levels. First off, Ken's radical sense of humor, the way he will say, this is amazing, but the problem with this is, you know, and I was laughing out loud reading it. And then just the brilliant expression of evolution from the Big Bang and before to now, of every aspect and dimension of sort of the expression of God was spectacular for me. And just the sheer force and poetic nature of his writing. And then I went on basically to read every book that he'd ever written up until that point. For the most part. And then Grace and Grit was one of the books that I read late in the game. I took it on a vacation with the extraordinary woman who I was in a relationship with at the time. And I read the book and started reading it to her on vacation in Hawaii. And by the 5th page or something, we were both crying. And I said, no, we can't read this on our Hawaii vacation. So I went back and read it when I was shooting a movie in Atlanta in 2008. I was working on a film as an actor, and I read, and it just it crucified me in a way that there was this part of me that had a recognition about transcendent love and selfless love that I became tangible in a way that I hadn't wasn't quite aware of that terrain in such a way. And so I was devastated by the book, and yet I was totally uplifted and inspired by this sense of what is selfless and transcendent love. And I didn't think of it as a movie then. I just was blown away and loved it, and I thought, I want to be part of this. In short, I wanted to meet Ken for many years when I was reading all of his other work, and he's so reclusive and hard to meet and etc. That eventually I thought, after 4 or 5 years of trying to connect with him, I said, you know what, this is selfish. I want to meet him for me, and I don't need to. I can let this go. You know, I don't have to meet him in this biological world. You know, I'm so touched and in love with this man's mind and his resonance, and I want to be in service to that, you know, so forget my desires and wants. Literally, I took it off of my desktop. 48 hours later, someone reached out to me from Boulder Integral, Namali, and said, would you like to do an interview on our radio show, etc.? I can introduce you to Ken. And I was, this is amazing. And then he and I were simpatico right off, talked for I don't know how many hours, you know, straight. And then subsequently he offered me an interview in my first documentary film. And then Grace and Grit, the conversation started coming up about where it was and how this needed to be a story, I felt, for a broad audience and access into his work. And so then it sort of went from there.
Yeah, Awakening Worlds. We isn't that what it is? Awakening Worlds?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yes, we saw the trailer. I don't think we have a screener of it yet.
Yeah,
but,
I realized like it was too late for me to order the DVD by the time we were. Oh, look, you know.
But it looks very, very intriguing. We're definitely going to watch it.
Some of our favorite people are interviewed there. And
oh, well, we know quite a number of those people.
Sure.
Just be yourself. That is so hysterical. We couldn't send it. We had to send it to everybody. Stuart Davis is a good friend. And certainly, well, anyway, but that was just hilarious. It's so well done. Congratulations on that, Sebastian. Everybody should see it.
Thank you. That was the first short film that I executive produced, and then Stuart wrote and directed it, and then he and I were both in it as part of an ensemble cast. And I put the whole thing on my American Express, like I did with my first documentary, The Awakening World. And
Wow.
Stuart and I met through those same lines of, through through Integral, essentially, and we were simpatico right off. And he's such a beautiful and brilliant mind. And he actually his song, yeah, he's wonderful.
He did.
Because I just think because of his comfort in terms of embodiment, right? And his his desire to touch those spaces inside of himself that are fresh, wanting to cover new terrain, right? And I think that's the job of the actor in that way. But he wrote this spectacular song called titled Nicola, and he has a couple versions of it, a remix and an acoustic. And for anyone listening, it's on YouTube, and it's one of really the most spectacular songs I've ever heard, and I love it. And it felt to me, the closest thing to it felt to me like U2's One, that song that was made very popular by U2. So it's the theme song, though, in Grace and Grit. It plays in the credits, and it plays during a very, very powerful scene also.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's solid. That's really beautiful. I'm so glad that his work plays a part in the film.
Oh yeah.
I felt like it was synchronistic also in the way because because Stuart and I met Ken in similar ways, in the way that we were both really wanted to meet him and couldn't. And then I had sort of dedicated a lot of my writing on the Huffington Post, et cetera, to Ken, and Stuart had dedicated an album to Ken. And so I felt like, just his fingerprint to naturally be in it, was obvious. And I was just sort of, I think, in service, carrying a torch to Ken's work by making this film. And that seemed to be a natural ingredient for its greater expression.
Well, Stuart performed at CoSM. He had a solo evening of music and comedy and sketch and monologue. He was so memorable, and we were friends before that, but he came around and gave an evening to CoSM when we were in the city on 27th Street, and it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. So if you're out there, Stuart, come back to CoSM when it's safe. We're gonna have a stage, and we're gonna really have it more professional. So we really hope that you'll come, and so Stuart too. We'll do an evening. Wouldn't that be great? Get the two of you together on stage. Oh. I'm already programming.
Well, he was. I met Stuart more in depth in 2001 when we were all kind of sequestered with Ken, talking about what is integral art, and so he was one of the, what we were getting to was it's hard to talk about integral art or probably even integral storytelling without talking about the integral artist or integral author, because that story emerges from an informed source. And in the case of an integral approach, I think, to anything, that calls on the storyteller, I think, to be equal to the subject if it's an integral subject. And if they're not, then it's not going to touch all of the levels that one could. And so I think that the quest of the integral storyteller is a heroic one in this culture, because it's not the common approach, because that's more guided by whatever is popular and makes money. So because
the success of an integral storyteller would be,
hey, it's scripture, it's gospel. What's the best story to tell? That's the integral story. What will unite us with spirit as rapidly as possible, and allow us a perspective of seeing the cosmos and our world as sacred and want to treat it that way.
Yes. Well, but how would you just define integral storytelling? I mean, in your work, how would you approach it? Integral storytelling.
Yeah, I was looking at one of your beautiful pieces recently of the artist painting and the seeing and the seeing and the seeing from all these different levels and spaces inside, and that sort of flow and that dynamic, and then how do we harness that and express it into a language that then can be shared, right? And I think that in any kind of meditative or contemplative practice, there is this in its healthy form, transcendent form, there's this omega point pull to evolve. In other words, in layman terms, there's this intuition, I think, that we have about what bee pollinates what flower, right? How do we fall in love, and what choices do we make to order even the food we eat? We feel that thing. I'm going to eat this. This is healthy for me. And we have these deep senses. We don't always pay attention to them. But when we do, then we're able to channel and allow these things through us, right? As opposed, I think, to from us. And so I think really, for me, the process giving myself up to that in the very sense of transrationale, right? This knowledge and wisdom beyond my own possibility, right? I think about existence in this world being far greater and more radically creative than any one individual can imagine. And, not even in philosophical terms, but just by the very nature that every mind and every being is only one aspect of the extrapolation of consciousness. So we cannot, by nature, imagine it in its entirety or in its immediate growth. We can only, at our very best moments, touch it and be on the outer edges, right? Which is what the two of you, your art does, and I think why it is complex and rich and sophisticated and profound, and yet why it's also accessible, that people look at it and they're not quite sure what they're seeing and experience very often. That a broad realm of individuals can look at your art and say, whoa, something's going on here, I don't know. Like looking at the spectacular butterfly or the sunrise or the sunset, something's being articulated that's profound from deep within and far beyond. So I think trusting that for me is integral to that process. And then as I unpack it, let's say as an author, as a writer, whether it's in book or screenplay, or in storytelling, whether it's meditative or just short stories, or as a filmmaker, as a director or producer or writer, and all the aspects that engage in that, is really saying, all right, what are then, breaking down those elements as we go and saying, what's the purpose of this line, or how is this happening? And then trusting the collaborative nature of that, trusting the collaborative process, whether it's with the actor or with the makeup person or with the places that we're going to shoot in, or with my DP, or with every aspect of filmmaking is so complex and rich. I think going into a film, and like going into this film, one of the first things I like to do is after this, and the job of producer, director, and writer is very different jobs. And I understand the relationship between those particular jobs and how those jobs relate. And lens testing for me is very important. So I did over a week of just lens testing before. In other words, how are we seeing this? How's the audience going to see this picture? Are they going to see this? How are they going to take into this movie? Whose perspective is it from? And in this case, right, it's from Treya's voice and from Ken's eyes. Yeah, and then it ultimately integrates into one being. It changes and then it integrates into this sort of expression that's beyond both of them. Right?
Yeah. Well, wow. Yes, the integral storytelling. I wanted to just comment that that in my definition of it would be that it encompasses body, mind, and spirit. I mean, very simply, but body being like the story addresses the way we take care of the mortal shell. The story addresses the mind and how we sort of harness it utilize it, and purify it. And then the spirit, our direct contact with the divine. So a story that does that wraps itself around those three things would be an integral storytelling. I'm really into storytelling, so I think those are the best stories, and I'm really excited to see your film, which you proposed that subject, integral storytelling.
I mean, it's a true story in Ken's case, which is a tragic story, which is also something that a gift then that he summoned from this experience of he doesn't get a break, I have to say, as a Superman. It's kind of, he's been given the heavy weights of life, dealing with such a tragic loss, and having to that's like such meditative practice, prepared him for being there for Treya in such a magnificent and amazing way, and then to continue the love by weaving her voice now to be known by millions, we hope, to be amplified through your film, as well as those will be repurposed to read the book again and things like that. All of that, I think, will help a world working through the issues of mortality. And it is very prescient and important issues that the book brings up and resolves in a spiritual way that is that maintains an intellectual caliber that is that rises above instead of sinks to a very material conclusion, which is by far the most popular solutions that we'll find, or fantasy solutions. This is a documentary that's spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I in that nature, in that stream of thought, I want viewers to be able to go into the film and feel what it feels like to be enamored and passionately fall in love, right? A woman with a man in this case, or a man with a woman, and then to feel the challenges in that once we open up. And then to feel the hopes and anxieties and aspirations around what the possibilities are with union between two human beings. And then
the takeaway also is in, how does all this sort of alternative medicine and meditation and all that stuff affect the healing? Isn't that part of what you're addressing in the film as well, is her confronting, how she's going to fight this disease, and all of her knowledge about healing, and all of her friends coming to bear.
In the plot, yes, but I think in this film, I'm using it as more of as a metaphor, in the way to say, in life, what's really going on, like her journey to passionate equanimity. That this is a story of a woman who always wants to fall in love, and gets in popular terms, the stories in relatable terms, that is a woman who wants to fall in love and get married and have family, and she just thinks, well, I'm in my 30s, never going to happen. And then she meets this guy and she's like, oh my God, I've known this being in another life, in another way, beyond. There's something resonant that's happening here. And then the fears, then once they start to fall in love, then the sort of fears of, well, is it going to work? Is it going to, we're going to be able to stay together? and then on his side having to ground all of these things that he is the great expressor of, that he's being forced into this place within himself to show up. And I think that metaphorically is the passage of love, right? That we fall in love, and it demands these great things of us that we would never want to sign up for. But we love the being, we care for the being, we want to be with the being, in service to the being, and get to know ourselves through one another so much that we don't abort the mission, right? That it's worth the price of the candle, however that candle burns. And I think in that case, Ken and Treya are woven and bound together in a spectacular way with these spectacular fireworks that have a certain melancholy to it, that have a passion and a light and a beauty to it, that have also a brutal pain, and then ultimately a selfless and transcendent love. And I think that we all, poetically aspire to that. So many books and poems and paintings and sculptures and movies and et cetera have been made about that, because it's largely ineffable, and it always has to be re-expressed. We always have to keep asking the same question: what is love? What is the purpose of life? What is meaning? What are we really doing here? Because there's no definitive reducible answer. So it is strictly experiential, like any great artwork, like so much, like this beautiful piece behind you, right? If I look at it, I'm immediately drawn in, but I could sit in front of that for God knows how many years and just look at it again and again and again, and always, because it offers up all these new questions. And I think I wanted this film to do that, to offer that to people, to say, what is that deepest reach of deep inside of myself, of what is that love? Where can my love go? Can it be passionate? Okay, that's common. Can it be romantic? Yes. Can it be selfless? Can it be imperfect? And then through that, can something wonderful and glorious beyond my imagination be born in the way that it acts alchemically to transform me into something even better, right? And that's the power of love, and that's really what the story is. It's a story ultimately about selfless and transcendent love as articulated by these two spectacular beings.
Oh, interesting. Amazing. We knew Ken before he was with Treya. And and it was when we all lived in Cambridge. Well, no, he lived in Cambridge and we lived in Boston. And he called us. I was never so shocked to pick up the phone and it was Ken Wilber on the other side, because already Alex had been studying all the same things that you mentioned and passing a lot of it on to me. And I'd read Ken Wilber, but I hadn't, you would always talk about Schopenhauer, and you were studying Nietzsche, and you were doing all those people too.
Well, it was actually,
philosopher.
Of course I knew Nietzsche, but I hadn't studied Schopenhauer until Wilber pointed him out, and Schelling. I completely missed Schelling, and it was Ken in his early visits that he was the only reference point, a live philosopher who would talk about spirituality. If you're tripping and you're seeing God, you want to have somebody who's really smart talking about that stuff, like Alan Watts. Who really knows their shit and is grounded in reality, all the levels of reality. How many levels of it? That guy knows more reality levels than most people will ever experience. And so, and he's been there and explored them, in a variety of ways. And so, by his pointing out Schelling, who you mentioned, and Schopenhauer, it brought this idealist tradition alive for me that I had been previously unaware of. And that idealist tradition, I think, has always been part of, as we were saying, religious or spiritual storytelling. Because most likely, if we're talking of a spiritual world, we can evoke it in some way, but we have to, in some way, convince others or share that. What is the good news? The ultimate good news is that there is a spiritual reality, and however you clothe that story, in the most compelling, wrapping, that's the story. Get to the heart of the matter. And I think that that Schelling said, point to the infinite. A work of art that doesn't take us to the infinite has not gotten there yet.
That is so beautifully expressed. Two particular things there about the wanting to, in a state of immersive thought or contemplative practice or hallucinogenic, whatever the thing is, in a dark night of the soul, to want to be guided by someone who's really smart, who really knows all these layers and levels and facets of reality, to say, I have complete confidence in the teacher, that the student learns the best when if I'm with Bruce Lee, whatever he says, no matter how ridiculous it is, I know I can trust it. Just do the kick 1,000 times. Then if that's what he says, then that's the way to go. And I absolutely felt that way about discovering Ken's work. I think that's what's so addictive about it and transformative in the way that no matter who I read, I always go back to reading Ken, always, because the dexterity for him to be able to articulate all these faces of reality and levels with such complexity and beauty and humor is amazing and extraordinary. And then when you're saying about Schelling pointing towards the transcendent, I remember I was into Schopenhauer, and then through reading Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, there's a verse in there that I can visualize on the page where Ken talks about, I think, Hegel in admiration of the mutual respect and admiration for Schopenhauer, saying we were waiting outside and we just wanted to hear Schopenhauer speak, and it was written however long ago, and Ken had put that verse in SES in Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and I remember thinking, well, I want to read that guy, and then I got into it, and it was very challenging. It was very tough at first, but I stayed with it, and then I was same thing. I was rocked, and it was ultimately that what you're saying there, Alex, about pointing to the transcendent, right? And I think in some way, not the job of the artist, but even intuitively, I think it naturally happens. Like, the two of you, your artwork is so beautiful that everyone wants to say, "What's that?" Right? But it's almost like a neon sign saying, we've got free chips and beer here, right? And then everyone comes in and like, we want the free chips and beer, and you're like, ha ha ha. Actually, there's crucifixion and resurrection here.
Oh, yeah.
And then they leave going, oh my God, the chips and the beer.
I know. Alex calls it the Carney Barker. The Carney Barker, the come on in. Because we go around, we take pictures of sacred sites around the world, and then we bring them back and show them to people. And they're just amazing. Like, the temples that people have built, the Baha'i and the Khajuraho in India and the, Elephanta, and it's incredible. These beautiful, even the, in the forest, there's beautiful sacred places. So yeah, it's like the Carney Barker. Come on in.
Yeah, well, in the same way that an edifice, like a temple, can be an invitation, to a sacred reality, a story, which is embedded in that temple, actually, because a temple can be an integral story, basically. I mean, all at once kind of a vision. That to unpack basically becomes a story. And I think that in that way, these sacred tales, are the thing that unites all the different world sacred traditions, that they're in touch with a visionary world, basically. Another way that or term that would include the spiritual, because I would think that an integral story or an integral analysis of anything would have to include a spiritual module, that would be pretty deeply foundational as well.
I wanted to ask Sebastian if you grew up as a spiritual person. Or did you have a realization that you suddenly, somewhere along the way, that you were a spiritual person? How did that go for you? We have our spiritual story, don't we? I mean, we all have like, what.
How did you meet God?
How'd you meet God?
My intuition on that, it's a beautiful. Thanks for that. My intuition on that is always to not speak about it conventionally, right? But to flip it on its head and speak about it in its converse, right? That if we think back, I've admired so many brilliant artists and philosophers and psychologists and etc. And from Stan Grof to Freud and Jung and etc. And then really then looking at meditative practices that impacted me from, Ramana Maharshi was a huge impact on me. And then contemplative practices, certainly Ken and Alan Watts and Shunryu Suzuki, etc. And thinking back, well, the embodiment of, who am I today and yesterday and the day before and the year before, and then just out of the womb, and then in the birth canal, and then in the womb, and then before that, and what aspect of me is that spark between two people's eyes that ultimately result in or lead to my conception, and then what is the sparks that happen before that between all those other thousands of people, the grandparents and the parents and parents and parents before them, and then taking it back to different tribes, and then even predating human experience, and then taking it ultimately all the way back, to that basic spark of light and attraction, right? The eros and these molecules, and then these just atoms, and these protons and electrons and neutrons. And so I think about when does that exist? When does that recognition happen? I suppose that the wider the eyes are open, the earlier it happens. And I'm not sure if there was ever a moment where I thought of, I think there's certainly a moment or a time where I understood egoically what it is to be me or have some sort of personality in this world. But I think, that I always had, I can't define a time where this life begins. I feel like I can, feeling the way back into the womb and having a sense of just what light is, what light is, and resonance, not in a conventional sense, but in a transrational and intuitive sense. Yeah. And then I felt very strongly called since day one. And I've always been really eccentric, right? My whole life, yeah. And I think in that way that it's to touch the paradox of what's really going on, i.e., in other words, to ground that. One of the things that's beautiful about what's happening right now with the sort of global pandemic, and then the social and cultural reactions to it, and contemplative reactions to that and response to it, is that we look up at the moon, and I think, well, that thing is real. That's dust and sand and rock, and it's 200,000 miles away, right? And the gravitational pull of the Earth, and it's, orbiting around us. It's spectacular. It's real, but it's in free fall, and so are we, and so is the sun. And that's real science, you know what I mean? And that's where science touches philosophy, right? And I think touches art, that I think about, science only, as much as we love science and is brilliant and extraordinary as all our discoveries are, science doesn't barter in truth. It only barters in truthfulness. It only barters in epochs. It only barters in what's right for the time, right? And it's always changing. Yeah. And so I think about consciousness, and I think about spirituality, and I love the question so much, because I think that your question being the recognition of being a spiritual being, right? When is that? What is that? And I think that the danger, or what's happening very often, that this pandemic is beautifully challenging, is that so many people are familiar with this term. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, but it gets homogenized through this sort of exit green meme kind of culture, new age culture, where people understand it here, but it's not being embodied. People understand I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. I'm only here for a brief period, right? I get it. But to really embody that would mean to not be afraid of death, right? It would mean to understand egoically my evolutionary impulse to survive, but to ultimately know that I must leave this world and I must not survive. I must die out for the greater good of this spiritual being having this human experience. And so I think a lot of what this situation brings about, which interests me as an individual and as an aspect of greater spirit, is that we must, and perhaps this is the time where we've now, with 8 billion people in the world, come to terms with the fact that we have to redefine and reorient ourselves with what is birth and life and death. And isn't it spectacular, death? I mean, what an amazing thing. What a wonderful rite of passage and paradigm bust and shift. And so I think I've always been, I suppose in short, to express it in terms of practice and engagement with my focus intellectually in this world, and my focus emotionally in this world, and my focus sort of transcendently or spiritually in this world. I've always been drawn to relationships, to practices that pulled me beyond, that made me not afraid of death, that made me want to go beyond, want to be here now, forever, but in the way that I also was touching forever here and now, right?
What sort of practices are you referring to? You mean physical practices? Yeah,
any kind of meditative practices early on, in simple senses. I think the early practices of just staring at the candle and trying to evaluate where it comes from and what it is, right? The transmission of energy from the wax and the fire and the wick to the air, and understanding, like the ocean, to watching, well, where is the water now as it's evaporating up into the clouds before it comes down, and thinking about, well, lightning, it appears to come from the clouds to the earth, but it doesn't really. It's a charge that exists simultaneously, and that electrical current, that charge, it's like the artwork or the voice that inspires, and the entity or the individual who is inspired. It doesn't go from inspirer to inspired. They happen together like the bee and the flower. They're inseparable, right? It's instantaneously co-emergent, right? And so I think about looking at the flame was a great early meditative practice for me, like 7, 8, 9, 10, and then laying in the water and trying to know, where does the water end and does my skin begin? Okay, well, I've lost that barrier. Where does my blood begin and the salt water start, and lost that barrier? And then just trying to lose these barriers, and just in a form of play, not in a form of any kind of intent. And then later developing more conventional Zazen practices of sitting and witnessing the breath, and thinking about, this breath is the same breath that carries all sentient beings and all existence, and then thinking about and trying to feel into, who am I, right? And I am the I that's here now and 10 years ago, and in the womb and before, and then the individual who sat here before me. As we were talking before this, you were saying about the resonance of these tribal communities that lived where you are now in New England, and feeling them there, right? And
actually the Hudson Valley, but which is way south of New England, but it is about the native people who lived where we are now, lived along the Hudson River from Manhattan up to just beyond us. Yeah. And it was they could take their canoes down to to Manhattan, the big commercial center, trade, and be back the same day, because the river flows both ways. Every 6 hours it changes direction. So their canoes would just go, and there was like a commuter river, and there are very few of them in the world, but it's rare, but it isn't unheard of, and there are others in each continent. Allyson, goes with the tide.
Allyson, I love that metaphor, and you brought that up before we started talking here on the call about the Hudson River switching directions every 6 hours, and thinking about that as the breath of the ocean and of life, and I'm really, I think, applying that in our spiritual practice of saying the in-breath and the out-breath, and there is this time for me to leave. So why do I need to cling on to that time for me to leave? Why not love and embrace that time for me to leave as a beautiful celebration, saying, like, God, it's gorgeous when a flower falls from a tree and you can just pick it up right after it's fallen, and it's like spectacular, like it's our time with 8 billion people on this planet to embrace that. say these, flowers are falling, and let's celebrate that thing. How different would life look if we weren't saying, all these people saying, well, we can live longer and we can reverse aging. Like, well, really? Do we really want to do that? Like, if you can't do it in 100 years, then it's time to move on to something else.
Give somebody else a chance.
Well, our will to survive, our will to survive, like you were saying, our strong will to survive, in combination with our, integral focus on keeping the mortal shell as healthy and long living as we can possibly do that, is not, in my mind, at all mutually exclusive with not being afraid to die. I feel that they can exist simultaneously without conflict. You can not be afraid to die. Of course, nobody wants to experience pain or like have a big tree limb fall on their head and that's how they die. You don't know how you're going to die. As Alex told Zena, that's God's secret. So, we don't know that, and it could happen at any moment. A bus could come through here, and we could just be plowed over. You don't know what's going to happen the next moment, but to live your life in the purest way for your body, yes, we can take care of ourselves and survive as long as we can.
It's beautifully expressed, and I agree completely. And I think that I've listened to Martin Luther King speak, and I have a book of a lot of his unpublished writings, and I think he was such a powerful, spectacular speaker. And a lot of his less known verses, sometimes I'll just flip them open and read it. The Papers of Martin Luther King Jr. that came out, volume 6, came out a few years ago, and he speaks in a way that it relates, that everyone can relate to it, that so many of his verses are read by pastors, and they're accessible, and yet he's speaking in a transcendent way when he's using these myths, right, about the promised land, about Moses. And I think about, yes, absolutely, right, we want to conserve and care for this life and this physical being in this process. I think the challenge is that a lot of times when it's sold, the let's stay alive, it's often through popular culture and the nature of lowest common denominator entry point. People do it out of fear, right? They say, oh my God, I got to stay alive. Got to keep these people alive. Death is the enemy. Death is bad. And so when I talk about the reorientation of what life and death is, certainly, with anyone having a kind of transcendent or spiritual practice and being deeply in touch with that notion is always present, right? As it's articulated in so much of your art, right? But for most individuals, the nature is to be afraid of what we don't know, right? And the soonest we can get over being not afraid of what we don't know is to be not afraid of death, right? Because it's the one thing that we are not able to quite, express with great detail, that we're not able to draw a map to, although we have these great practices. Certainly the Book of the Dead is great, and understanding this. I think Ken, has been hugely influential for me in articulating the Bardo realm, and then how, we dissolve and live beyond that in ways. But I think to ground that in this world requires a certain return to the breath, which is why the breath is so important in so many meditative practices, because it's just this immediately experiential, knowable feeling of well, the in-breath feels really good, and the out-breath feels really good. So there's no reason that the out-breath and the in-breath of this pattern of life and death will not also be as spectacular. And so I think I just would like to, as a filmmaker, as an artist, as a storyteller, invite people in to say death is an integral aspect of life, and let's pay more attention to that beauty of death and as an aspect of transcendence. Yeah.
Wow. That's I think that's really important certainly for a spiritual teaching, because ultimately to live fully means to embrace your own death and not be in fear of it. I mean, certain reasonable fear. Yes, that's a car. Don't, we're not saying kill yourself, but just if you're able to say yes to the whole contract. I know I signed up for this. I know there's a termination point and that I'm not sure about it. I signed up for that. You're just admitting that you signed up for it and that you're okay with it and that you subscribe to it and that you're going to make the most of it. It's kind of like Buddha said, that's probably our greatest teacher is death itself, because that's what gets people's attention, and you see that there's a reason you should be waking up, and and that it's a important thing for us all to contemplate, the value of a life well lived. And as Socrates and many others said, to know thyself is the integral story. Who is the great I am, and it's that continual revolution to come to know the one self. It is, I think, the great introduction that art has the possibility of directing us toward. And it sounds like you've used really all of the media that I'm familiar with is paving the way for that kind of message for the viewer.
We're very excited to one day, when it's made the rounds and all of the ventures that you feel that it's going to go to, we look forward to screening it here as a spiritual film. We've screened we screened the first premiere of the DMT, the Spirit Molecule, with was here over a decade ago. But anyway, we would love to, and we look forward to doing that. Is there anything that you can tell us, about your, what you're working on, how we should find out more about you, that sort of thing? Yeah,
and how's the movie it's in completion?
Right, how's that going to happen around this pandemic and stuff? How are you going to release the movie?
Sure. It changes the distribution a little bit. A lot of films are are delayed in terms of physical production, and I'm working on several different projects right now. I have several different IP that are in various stages, from book to script, to story, both series and feature films. For Grace and Grit, ironically, I think it draws greater interest to the film and ultimately to the distribution of it. There's been a lot of interest in it quite recently, especially right now. Number one, because it's a finished film, because it's beautifully executed. And also I think people are asking more around this pandemic, what is really going on? What is love? That people want content that is
substantial.
Yeah, substantive. Yeah. So the interest has been strong. I've had a lot of different people reaching out, kind of saying, what are you doing with this? We'd like to distribute it, etc. So it'll be everywhere this year at some juncture. Just a matter of we want to take the care to give it to the distribution platform that will serve it the best, and make it the most available in the most places and shine a light on it. Because I certainly think the core audience are the people who love stories, the people who love Integral, who love Ken's work, are already going to respond very strongly to it. And so I want it, we want it though to have we want to use it as the gateway drug into the Ken Wilber writings. So we want to give it a broader, more, invite people in. What you were saying earlier about, this passage of art and how you have, the two of you have done so much artwork, right? You're prolific in the way that just so many things. Mm-hmm. And how can you say these things in so many ways, in so many incarnations, right? Each painting has a fingerprint that's related, and yet they're so different. Each one is a completely different experience. Every time I look at one of your pieces, I just think, I love that part of it, right? And I think about, in terms of film and in terms of Grace and Grit, that this, I was just thinking for an instant about your love, the two of you, Allyson and Alex, that I think about, what is that spark, right? And I think about what I tried to paint in the first minutes of Grace and Grit, in the very opening, that these two individuals are drawn together. They're interested in each other, they're attracted to one another, but it's almost like they intuit. This individual, I am going to get to know myself through this individual. And this other individual is going to get to know him or herself through me in such a wildly scary, adventurous, beautiful way. I'm in, I can't not go, right? And that's why we call it falling in love. Because part of us wants to dive in. We're attracted to all these beautiful things. But part of us is like, no, it's scary. Don't take me there. Right?
Well, I can say this. It's a transformative journey. It's exactly as you say, where two people who rub against each other for that long, rub off all the rough edges. And and then when you have children, it's even more so. It's just like everything gets rubbed off. Every button that can be pressed gets pressed to the degree that it's flattened, and you get better. You get to be a better person, is what I mean. Like, I'm a much better person because of Alex, and I think the same. I think he would say the same. We've really transformed together.
Yeah. We've been sanding on each other.
Sanding down those rough edges.
Yeah. I've still got a few.
And having a child is even more so, because they're so honest with you. They never miss an opportunity to tell the truth. So, so you get to be confronted with yourself, and it is a transformative journey. And I just say this, it's very scary for some people to make that decision about who that person is going to be. And I just have to say this, well, it's worth it. It's worth it if you choose. See, we have one thing we say to everybody about how to have an enduring relationship. It's like a lot of people don't want an enduring relationship. They just want to have a lot of relationships and have a lot of fun and enjoy. And I think there are a lot of people who don't really have the experience of an enduring relationship, say with their own parents. So they can't be expected to see it as the advantage that we see it as. Our parents did stay together. So, even if it was tough, I think it was really worth it in the end. And as you get older, it's quite a bit of fun to have known somebody for a long time. So it's really a good idea. And we both have appreciated and enjoyed monogamy for 44 years. So, hey, it handles stuff. So it's a good idea in our opinion, but people want it or they don't want it. I don't know. I think it's a great journey.
I just want to say that the duration of a relationship, in some ways, for my life, love was so revolutionary and so impossible in my world one day, and then the next day it was there as a revolution in my life. Mm-hmm. That I knew that right then the main event in my life was that love exists. Now, whether you were going to suddenly leave my life, I didn't know. But I knew that love is real. So whether it lasted a day, I remember writing in my notes, whether this is over tomorrow or not, I don't give a fuck. I am so grateful. Love fucking exists, yes,
right. But then what is the one thing that we always tell everybody about the enduring relationship? I haven't said it yet. You said. to have an enduring relationship, there's one rule. The first thing is...
Okay, you choose, and then you stop choosing.
You choose wisely, though. That was what I was going to say, is that you choose wisely. And how do you know you've chosen wisely? Ask your friends and your parents. I'm just telling you. People will tell you if you really are willing to listen, because most people are not. And frankly, I hate to say this, but you know,
I'm not sure your parents would have approved of me if they really knew
me.
They
didn't know you. They didn't know you. It was a good idea not to ask them. But they could see. No, but they did choose you in a way, because they could see how happy and improved I already was in just knowing you for the very shortest time I was up there. And I healed because of you. I was a better me because of you already. I was happy. Everything was better. I mean, they could see that on me. They didn't need to know you, so they didn't.
As a producer, there's a spin-off podcast here where Alex and Allyson Gray counsel Sebastian Siegel on relationship. You know, it's like the future of reality TV right here. We've got it.
Sebastian, don't worry about it.
No, what you're saying is really perfect for the integral framework in terms of depth and span. That most people very often get in a relationship, particularly in these big cities and the way that technology moves now. I see it a lot of times, obviously in California, men or women get in a relationship. They hit a certain level of depth that gets uncomfortable, and they drop out because there's so many other opportunities. There's a million people, one phone call or click away, and then let's just go into another. And so because of that, they end up in a pattern of cyclical relationships, dropping in for a month or 3 months or 5 months or a year or whatever, and then they just hit a certain amount of depth. And at that certain amount of depth where it requires confrontation with the self, they get uncomfortable, so they go for the new relationship. So they're always hitting that level of depth and never going further. And obviously the monogamous or the committed relationship, at the very least, demands vertical growth and depth. That's not about span. It's not about having the same relationship again and again and again, articulated through different beings, but saying I'm going to be with this one individual, and we're going to go deep, 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 and that's going to require, committed dive on behalf of both parties. And that, for me, as an artist, as an individual, as a friend, as a son, as a lover, is always what interested me. And I've always been in committed relationships since I was a child, and not out of any sort of moral sense. It was just what interested me. I require depth and intimacy. I love beauty, and I'm attracted to this natural world. But in order for me to engage, I have to be able to feel like I'm touching different aspects of myself. So it requires the dexterity of the other being to want to engage in that way, to be able to have the capacity to offer a clear attention span, and ask difficult and curious questions and push in there, and then also be able to open up and share in those ways. And then also for me as an artist, or as somebody who is an audience person and a consumer of art and media, the same thing. The art that I'm drawn to both create and that I'm drawn to consume, both does those things also. It offers up, hey, here is a mirror for some deep aspect of your own being that you haven't yet really looked at in this light or in this way or from this angle. Then I say, I want to get into that thing. That's quite good.
Oh, well, maybe we should call that the great ending of our great artwork together. And we should thank you so much. Unless you have any, do you have any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I just have such a great appreciation and respect and admiration for you both. And thank you so much for having me here. I think that you're a reference point for what's possible. Not just as lovers and as of mates, as artists and as human beings. And it's always refreshing and inspiring, for me, to look at you both and the work you do and the way that you show up in this world. I think that one of the dangers in this world is that a lot of spirituality gets homogenized, that people are saying things and not living and embodying those spaces. And the two of you really embody those spaces. So it's so wonderful to be in your presence and to be having this conversation with the two of you. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been such a joy learning a little bit about you. We can't wait to see the film. As soon as you can let us see it, we want to see it, and we'll screen it with our cosmonauts that are here, but then, maybe one day we'll get to, bring the Hudson Valley over to CoSM to see your movie, because it's a spiritual film about a hero that we've known since the mid 70s.
Someone I consider my, besides yourself, my longest spiritual friend.
He is a spiritual friend of us both,
and
really.
who has, been with me on my path and continues to inspire me. And so any way that we can help support the emergence of this project out to a wider public, just let us know, Sebastian. We'd be happy to help in any way possible. We love you, and we are so grateful that you took time today to share this magnificent gift for the world, which I think everyone will be grateful for having seen. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Love you both.
Thank you again for listening to the CoSM Podcast. To stay up to date on any future podcasts or virtual events, please be sure to follow Chapel of Sacred Mirrors on Instagram and Facebook, and to subscribe on all major platforms. To learn more about Sebastian Siegel and the upcoming film Grace and Grit, you can follow the links in the description to this video. Thank you to everyone who has made a donation during this time. Every donation is a stand for the future of CoSM and allows us to continue to bring inspiring and uplifting content like this to our community. You can make a donation by going to buildandtheon.com. And thank you to Decca for the soundtrack to this podcast. You can find Decca on YouTube, Spotify, and Bandcamp.